Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Politics in the Pulpit podcast. We're really glad to have you with us. We've got another excellent guest with us this week as we explore the lectionary readings and how power and politics influence how we might preach from them this week. Really pleased to be welcoming this week Fiona Bennett, is the minister at Augustine United Church in Edinburgh. Fiona, welcome.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be with you.
We're really pleased to have you here. So politics in the pulpit, is that sort of a home from home for you, or is it something that doesn't feature much in what you do in Edinburgh?
It's really interesting because I think that it depends what you mean by the word politics. I think politics means everything because it's to do with our relationships with people. So when I write a sermon or prepare any worship, I'm always thinking about, so if I say that, what's the implications for the personal and what are the implications for the political? By which I mean, how does it affect community, society, our world globally, which is how I would understand what politics is about. So I can't separate them. For me, talking about politics is about how our faith, what our faith has to say, how it interacts, how we live in the world at large. So I think it's an intrinsic thread within everything.
Yeah. Okay. So, and from your ministry at Augustine, where are there any particular things that have been big on your radar in recent times? Any particular issues that have been significant for you and for the community there?
So Augustine is a community that really works hard and aspires to be an inclusive community. It's not an easy thing to do, and we have a significant part of our membership are LGBTQI. A significant part of our membership have complex mental health issues. We all have mental health and have to look after mental health, but a significant number of complex issues. We have a significant number of people who have challenges who are varied in their ability and in their neurodiversity. And we're also very passionate, concerned about planet and justice in general. Justice for the planet, racial justice, those are all kind of issues that affect us. So, obviously at the moment with COP coming, everybody's thinking really hard about what do we really want to see happen? How do we need to change? How do we need to see our policy, within government and also within business, and how do we need to see things changing to really act a difference? So it's not just talking. It feels like we've been talking about eco-justice for a long time. What do we really need to do to see that change, and what can we do about it? How can we act? So that's been some of the big eco stuff that has been about. I think with all the pandemic things that have been going on, we've been really conscious of how that's been affecting all of our mental health, and just acutely aware of some of the issues that are going on for people with slightly more complex stuff that's there, and how people are perceived and supported within society, which is a big part of, mental health politics. It's about how does our society as a whole, how do we treat and support everybody? How do we put to use the kind of Hebrew Bible, the widow and the orphan at the centre and build outwards within our political systems. So whoever's vulnerable. And there's been quite a lot recently about within our, we've got quite a lot of trans people within the community. So thinking about some of the gender identity stuff that's been going on, that we've been quite aware of that. And there's been quite a backlash at the moment. A lot of our trans people are experiencing more hate than they have been. And maybe if a couple of years ago where things were beginning to change. So it's just conscious about all of that. That's just a few. Could go on for a long time.
Just the list. Picking up on COP, very conscious. I know it's the other big city not far away. But is that something that the whole church is really engaged with? Is it something that, I'm down in Essex. It's not in our faces in quite the same way. If we switch off the news, we could pretend it's not happening. But does it feel very live and active around the whole church community?
I think it does. We have Christian Aid Scotland have their offices within our building, within Augustine Church in the middle of town. So they're there, and you know, the walk that's happening, the youth walk that's happening from London to, they're going to come and drop by us on the one of the Saturday afternoons. We will be boat making as part of our harvest festival. And I think so, because it is so close, physically so close, I think there is an awareness about it, and people are just. It's a really interesting balance, actually, because certainly there's a concern that on the one hand, the environmental crisis is very real. But to scaremonger is not helpful. And it's particularly, so you've got to grasp the seriousness and hold that and do something about it. But to scaremonger, particularly at this point in time, perpetuates anxiety. And especially if you've got people who are prone to paranoia, you can get all sorts of difficulty within that. So it's a really interesting balance. So the schools, you know, the kids in schools, everybody's doing stuff about COP, and the whole environmental stuff is upped quite a lot, which is really good. One of the things that we have opted to do, a really simple thing in Augustine, this at the moment, is that we're doing a tree of life. So we've physically got a tree that we often use at Christmas time for prayers, sitting in the sanctuary, and every week we're adding leaves, and each leaf is a story that somebody emails in, which is a story of hope they've heard about new technologies or ideas or approaches that are offering hope or life-giving for the planet. And that's been really good. That's not to deny the seriousness, the gravity of the change that we all need to embrace. And that is part of our faith. But it's also about not being, sucked down in despair, because that also wouldn't help. So it's kind of everywhere in some senses. And it's about using the energy from that well, I think, is the challenge.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing about that as well. Each week, the wonderful team at JPIT also give me a bit of a list of some of the other issues they think are around at the moment that may set a bit of the political context for what we're talking about. And so the list this week, the defence talks between Australia and the UK and the US, and what that says about efforts for peace building, and the implications for that. And then obviously we've got politicians from the UK in the US for climate talks this week leading up to COP26 and the need for new sources of international climate finance. We have the ongoing inequalities in vaccine distribution and infrastructure needed for their delivery. And then particularly over the last few days, we've seen a lot in the news about gas prices and the rising cost of living alongside rising food costs and the ending of the universal credit uplift and the impact that all of that has on those in poverty. And then further afield, we've seen news over the weekend about girls being prohibited from secondary education in Afghanistan and the ongoing challenges that the situation in that country brings to us. I'm sure there are many, many others too, but those are some of the other headlines for our politics this week. And then liturgically, for those of us following that, we remain in the season of creation, and a couple more weeks to go with that, which feels very fitting. So having established a bit of context, we turn now to readings for this week. We have we're still in Mark, we're still in James, but we've moved on from Proverbs into the book of Esther. So a slight change of gear with our Old Testament reading. But I wonder, Fiona, if you've seen all three of those, where's your inclination to begin? Are you already seeing threads joining the three, or is there one text where you've thought, that's where I'm going? Is there anything that you see sort of emerging already at this stage?
I have to say, it's quite interesting because just in the last couple of months, we've moved on to the narrative lectionary, so not using RCL. So it's quite interesting to go back into them. And that's simply because it's trying to work with a hybrid format. So we're just experimenting with it. And so I've spent time looking at the three readings, and I found all of them quite difficult in interesting ways. I think why have I found them difficult? Esther is a book that you need the whole story. Yes. I think the extract is not necessarily helpful. I would say the same about the Mark passage, actually. That the Mark passage I could see, particularly when I think in our context of I'm really conscious when I'm preaching that sometimes you're preaching to people who can be very self-destructive and very self-loathing. So I'm really, really cautious how I use passages, and I have to give a lot of context. So the Mark passage needs a lot of context. The Esther passage is a really interesting story. Now, this week, this Thursday night, we have an event where we're interviewing Deborah Kayembe, who is the first Black rector of Edinburgh University. She started in the Democratic Republic of Congo as a lawyer, escaped as a refugee, came to Britain, and is now practicing as a lawyer. So it's going to be really interesting to hear her story. There's something about having fled power and coping with oppressive power in her story that I'm wrestling with in the book of Esther, which is really interesting. Xerxes, who's the king within this, has already got rid of one wife, Vashti, because she wouldn't appear before him and his pals to show off how beautiful she was. Who knows what exactly the context of all that is, but he's got rid of her, being manipulated by his pals. And then he chooses Esther, and there's a whole sort of stuff goes on with Haman and oppressing Mordecai, who won't bow before him. And then finally, when justice comes and Esther remanipulates Xerxes, actually, then you've got this kind of victory for the Jewish people. And I'm so conscious that as soon as I talk about Jewish people as a Christian, that most of the anti-Semitism in the world comes because of us. So within this story and this context, and also, you know, as the point of this book was being written, at the point of this book probably was being written, you've already got some Jews who were returning with Nehemiah and Ezra to rebuild the temple. So this isn't all people or any people, or this is, you know, and everybody's full of lots of different kinds of folk. So, but the response after Mordecai is elevated is that all of a sudden a whole lot of other folk are slaughtered. So there's a lot of really uncomfortable things in this passage that in this story that make me feel like I don't see that. That's not the God of the faith that I aspire to, that I see in Jesus, that I want to emulate in any sense. So, but going into the story, you have got this woman, Esther, who has been chosen because of her beauty, had to kind of hide her identity, play games to protect her people. And she manipulates Xerxes, who's been manipulated in different ways before, but that is the only power that she has. Interesting question. Do you know that all that stuff about women portrayed as deceivers, for good or for bad, because they're not given power, sort of like outright power within the patriarchal structures, so they behave with whatever power that they have, but then they can be demonized for that. So you've got the Eve stuff with that. Women all manipulate. That's a load of rubbish, you know. So there's all of that in that I just clangs for me really uncomfortably. The particular verse, not in the passage, but in the book of Esther, that really sits with me, inspires me, is when Esther has this discussion about with Mordecai whether she should go and plead for the king. And it's in the end of chapter 4. And it says, I'll go to the king, though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. There's this incredible nobility within Esther that says, well, this is the right thing to do. I have to do this, whatever it is, despite the cost. And as I think about our world today, I just think the sharing of vaccines, does my kid get vaccinated or does the kid in, you know, Uganda get vaccinated? Thinking about so much stuff about the environment, about justice, how do we rebalance wealth, the care of the planet, the use of carbon? At what point am I willing to say, actually, the right thing is that I have to be willing to take a sacrifice myself, and our country does, in order for others to be free? So, sorry, that's a whole spiel about Esther. Yeah. But there's an awful lot to wrestle with in that whole story and that whole perception.
I always find exactly that with something like Esther. It's very hard to take a chunk of Esther out without actually, you're going to have to tell the whole story anyway.
Yeah.
Because it can't be a given that people listening know or remember, and it doesn't. It's very hard to enter into it without explaining what's gone on before.
Sorry. The one other thing that really strikes me in Esther, and I think this reflects in Mark as well, actually, is there's a whole lot of stuff about power and how do you use power well. Xerxes, he was the Persian king. He had an enormous empire, but he was manipulated very easily, and he used and he disseminated his power badly. You see in Haman, again, somebody who gets power and wants to be glorified, whereas ego within all of that. You see these powerless women who also do have power. So there is a question within all of it. And even at the end, when Mordecai then decides to slaughter all the people who've stood against them, when we have power, how do we use it well? That was a big question that we looked at when same-gender marriage came about with a lot of LGBT folk within our community. So a lot of LGBT folk had been on the fringes of society. Their relationships hadn't quite been recognised. So when you then become the centre of power, how does that, in the sense that you have the same status as other people, and we could argue that they're still not exactly the same status, but technically in law anyway, how do you then wield power well? When you've been on the edges, do you then become the new oppressor, or do you change the system? But that's a big challenge. I don't think women in ministry have changed the system nearly enough. The Scottish Parliament was set up with a different setup to Westminster physically and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't see it's radically changed politics. So when you hold power, how do you wield it well? Huge challenge. And Jesus was really inspiring about all of that. Mm. Sorry, David. There you go. There's another ramble.
I love it. I was just going to say, before we perhaps drift into the James reading, or maybe we'll go to Mark first, because there seems to be more links in what we've been talking about there. A friend of mine wrote a thesis on basically Esther as pantomime, which I found very compelling, because there is something wonderfully or Shakespearean. It's very dramatic. Everything is, so the pole on which Haman is impaled doesn't have to be 25 meters, but everything is grand and is almost built for an audience. In Esther, it is a very theatrical story. These little things, like we're told in chapter 7, right at the beginning, that Xerxes is drinking wine, and you could almost imagine a Brian Blessed-esque sort of figure drinking wine there. And then we're told that he puts the wine down in a couple of verses. This is obviously quite important to the sense of what's going on. But at the same time, in the midst of all of that, Esther is measured and seizes her moment very carefully. And as you say, in terms of sort of manipulating the king back, she answers the two questions that actually she's heard before already. She knows what the two questions are going to be, and she takes a risk and manages to say a lot in very few words, because she's planned and thought through what she's going to say to make best effect of that moment. But there is something farcical, I guess, about huge elements of what happens in Esther.
And that's why it works so well for Purim, isn't it? When the story is told, and it is absolutely written. I think a pantomime's a really good kind of comparison, actually. It's really interesting in the book. There are very few adjectives to describe people, but the way the characters interact gives who it's goodies and baddies. In lots of ways, isn't it? So yeah. And that's really important to hear, I think, to feel the feeling of story and the power of story, which also I think we'll come to in Mark in some ways as well, to hear it as literature. So because too often for me, we're trying to justify the historical detail of stuff. And while that's important, it's the power of story is why this is here. And that feels really important as well. So I'll remember the pantomime. That's a great comparison.
Well, let's go to Mark then, because we've mentioned Mark a number of times, so which is good, drawing connections to him. We'll come back to James afterwards. So we're in Mark 9, where we've been for a little while now in the lectionary, and we've got verses 38 to 50. What strikes you here? Where's the good news and the bad news in Mark 9?
So I think if you just read this passage, I think it could be hugely, left on its own, it feels an amazingly destructive passage. If people with self-loathing, off you go and cut off your hand if it's causing you problems. I mean, it's just really, really unhelpful if you read it literally in that kind of sense. So the first thing I want to say is that this passage, for me, comes in a context of a wider set of passages, and that's really important. I mean, it's actually a wider scene. I think that's part of it as well. It's a very odd wee passage, sort of 38 to 41 is this stuff from John, and then 42 jumps back to this bit about the little ones. So what's the little ones got to do with anything? If you go just a little bit back, you can see that Jesus is in Capernaum and he's picked up this child. He has this child in his arms and then says, whoever receives one child in my name receives me. So I think that this passage actually, as a lectionary reading, would be better prefaced from 33. Because for me, I'm picturing Jesus standing with a child in his arms. And there's a bigger context to the story, but then John comes in, has a conversation which has to do with a slightly previous bit of the story, and then Jesus goes back to the child. So that's how I physically imagine the story. And I think that's quite kind of helpful to see. Since the since Transfiguration, the disciples have been, they came down from the mountain. There was this exorcism that they couldn't do. They're feeling a bit disempowered. They're not quite sure what's going on. They've had discussions about who's the greatest. So there's a real kind of struggle within the disciples of there's obviously kind of power tensions going on. Maybe a bits of feeling of kind of wanting power, feeling inadequate. I don't know. There's all sorts of stuff going on, bubbling on with the disciples. So that you then have this bit about there's something about egos. Jesus and his disciples, and they're all having this stuff, the scene's Transfiguration, and he says it's being like a little child, receiving people like little children, that accept and trust and openness that is very important. And then John comes in again about casting out demons, and Jesus is saying really, and the casting out demons bit is really interesting. If they'd use your name and abuse your name, and Jesus is saying, it's not about my name. It's about getting the job done. That's what's really important about getting the job done. And again, that is about ego. There's something about protecting self-interest within all of that. And then he has this little one on his arm, in my imagining anyway, and he says, whoever causes harm to one of these, and then he goes on with this great, again, this is drama. It's not pantomime. This is kind of tragedy. This is really strong language where he's saying to get in the way of a little one, whether it's a child as a child in his arm, or anybody who simply honestly and openly and innocently receives Jesus, who gets in the way of the good work being done, of the good news being manifest, of the environment being protected, of the LGBT people being included, whoever gets in the way of that is getting in the way of my work. And that is really bad. So for me, this is all hyperbole, and it's really important that people see that rather than read it literally and think about who should be cutting off whose foot. Yes. Which quite literally, that is one of the ways that we treat scripture, and that's very, very destructive, and misses the point of actually. It's much easier to think about cutting off a foot than dealing with the stuff about getting over your ego, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So that's what I see in this passage, but with a lot of struggles within it. Not an easy one to hear or to engage with.
Yeah, it's at first reading, it is a passage that you think, well, what do you do with that? As you say, there's so many reasons why this is going to be one where I was thinking to preach this, it's going to involve me really thinking through every word that I'm going to be using, even because it has the capacity to be so damaging if people don't engage with it well. One of the things I was struck here is how they're trying to hold together at this moment, sort of the community solidarity. There's something about them as a community. They're dealing with the hardships that come from the decisions they've taken and following Jesus, and they're trying to balance that, keeping a strong, solid community, but at the same time not excluding people who aren't in it yet. And it struck me that that's a challenge that many of our churches will face. We want to build up our community, we want to embrace relationships with one another, we want strong church sort of communities in that way, but at the same time trying to be open and inclusive and embrace those who aren't there yet. And it struck me that they're going through something of that here, and that's a bit of a challenge, and they've got this conflict that's ongoing within them. And then there's a challenge here to affirm all that is good from outside, as well as removing what is bad inside. And I think this challenges the assumption you sometimes come across that what's inside is automatically good and what's outside is automatically bad. And some of the great movements of the Spirit, to me, seem to come from far beyond the walls of the church, and we sort of follow on afterwards and say that's very important. And I think there's something of that here as well, but it's not an easy passage.
That's really interesting, David, actually, because I think that I'm actually, my mind's now going to Paul and some of the letters with the like of is it Corinthians, where, you know, or actually is it Ephesians, where it's about who's in and who's out, and how do you accept everybody within your within the community and value all as equal, and actually I think, yeah, how are you healthy within? How do you manage the kind of conflicts and tensions between people within a congregation? But how do you also, as you say, see the Spirit working beyond, recognize the work of God beyond who you are, which then should change you as a community? Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that leads into another. I'll go and mull that over. Yeah.
Shall we drift into James then? We've been in James for a little while, and this is the very end of James now. And I thought perhaps when I was thinking of links with the other passages, that there may be something with sort of causing people to stumble. There's something that seems to me here very important about the role that the whole community play in helping everybody. I thought that was a thing that really struck me with James. But what is some of your initial reflections on the James 5 passage?
I'm not a big fan.
Okay.
Why am I not a big fan? I'm not a big fan because, again, it's one of these things where it just feels like there's very clear instructions about do this or don't do that. Mm-hmm. And some of the bits about, you know, if there's suffering, let them pray, as if it's going to be a kind of magic healing. Mm-hmm. You know, and the prayer of faith will save the sick one, and the Lord will raise them up, and if they've committed sins, they'll be forgiven. I don't know. I think, again, James is one of these passages that, like you're talking about, is the context of community. It's really important that we see it within the context of the community at its time. You know, James calls people to action rather than simply thinking about things, which is a really good thing. But it needs a wider context as to why he was writing to these particular people, because not every specific instruction, there could be wisdom in why it's there. But I'm really cautious about things that give direct instructions, because people often interpret them quite destructively. Mm-hmm. So that's my response. So I felt very wary in response to this passage. It sounds like you didn't feel quite the same way, though.
Well, no, I totally resonate with the thing with the healing and sort of the oversimplified way of taking this, and then just been in so many occasions where someone says, "Oh, but it says here," but then this isn't what's happened, and you think, "Oh, okay." It just feels to me like a passage that going to need pastoral unpicking of how people take it away and use it, inevitably. But I think for me, I guess I was just struck with how one of the things here was about everybody playing their part in helping the community grow and develop. So whether it's praying with people or singing with people or whatever it was, there was something, or calling the elders. And I just struck you, obviously in Mark, you've got a community that's sort of traveling with Jesus as well. And they've got these tensions in their community, and they're arguing and conflicts are arising. And here, just this whole faith is not going to be sustained well without the community around you doing their bit as well. There was just something about it being a communal endeavor. But that doesn't necessarily deal with some of the specifics that come up in the passage.
That's a really healthy way of thinking about it, and you're just making me reflect that we so our congregation created a document just about 2 years ago called Ways of Relating, where we identified, we went through a process where we identified how we would like to behave towards one another, in the aspiration of being a community which includes difference and listens to difference and allows space for disagreement, but that doesn't mean you create barriers. We try to listen deeply to each other. So. And one of the things that's often said, and the reason I send out monthly mailings, and actually at the moment, and there's another copy of those Ways of Relating is going out this month, because folk are just really conscious that whatever you aspire to, this would be true for anything, it doesn't happen just because you aspire to it. And building good relationships and good community is a lifetime's effort. It just doesn't happen overnight or even in a couple of months. It's something. So this document is something that we can go back to, and just as a refresher all the time to remind us of what's going on. In some ways, there is a similarity with that in the like of James and a lot of the other epistles. How to be a community that follows Jesus, that is constantly emerging and changing. These communities were all emerging and changing, weren't they? Because there weren't such clear patterns as we need to be today. And how we work together well is not easy. It's never easy. But actually, I do believe that the witness of how we work together well, if we can work out how to work together well, it does provide us with skills and a model that is very evangelistic, because it offers gospel. For me, the good news of inclusion is about how we hold diversity together so that we all grow, so that we're all challenged, we're all transformed. But none of that is easy. It's all about willing to accept that I will be changed. When I listen, do I listen to you to be changed, or do I listen to you to argue my point? Joe, and that is all about, and all these things are. So, but I'm sure if you were to take one of our aspirations out of context, it could be just as unhelpful as reading little bits of James out of context or anything else. It's about the big package of how we as a community aspire to be followers of Jesus today, have healthy relationships with ourselves, which then reflect on healthy relationships with the planet, with other species. It's all that stuff about integrity that's really important. So a good challenge from you as well. Thank you.
Well, the other thing that struck me reading this, and it's come up a few times in all the texts we've looked at, is I think I happen to not be preaching on this Sunday, but I wonder if there's something actually about taking the opportunity to talk to folks about how we deal with scripture as well as part of this. Here's where this could all go very horribly wrong if we don't bring a healthy engagement and understanding of context and nuance and literature to what we're reading. And these all three of these readings seem to offer that very clearly, I think, as well. Are you someone who finds that you've got pieces of art or music or other things that come to mind as you prepare, or does that come later in the week? Are there any other things that have already struck you, thought I might try and find a way of shoehorning that in?
Well, I mean, as it happens, this Sunday we have our David Coleman, who's the Ecotide congregation, Eco Congregation Scotland, is preaching. So
brilliant.
Something that we do at Augustine is that every month we create a slightly different liturgy for every month following seasons. So season of Creation Tide, we're going to go into season of wholeness actually next month is where we're heading. And for each month there's a piece of art that is a theme that runs through the PowerPoints and stuff. So the piece of art for this month is it's by Jan Richardson. She's an American liturgical artist, and it's called For What Binds Us. Okay. So there's a theme within all of that about interdependence and interconnectedness, and which ties in very well to the concept of community. Interdependence can all sound very rosy and lovely. It's hard work.
Yes.
and it is within creation as well, but it's hard work that brings an enormous I don't like using the words benefit or reward because they're not always helpful in our kind of culture, but it brings abundant life. It really does. It transforms us through that process of willing to lose and to gain and to be changed, which I feel are very gospel kind of death, resurrection, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We're very interconnected as well. But yeah, for that which binds us. So that's the January traditions one. And it's lovely. It's got, if I could have had a copy of it here, but it's got things twisting together. And it's a really lovely piece. We also we have a meditation each week where different people do different bits of music and sometimes art. So I'll pass that out to whoever's leading, and they will come up with something for a theme for the week, which is amazing as well. Just to see what other people kind of come up with.
Yeah, love the sound of that. That's wonderful. I just give a little shout out here at this point, as I sometimes do, to a particular resource that I've found helpful as well. And so I want to just highlight the Esther commentary in the Tyndale series, which I haven't looked at these for a while, but this is written by my good friend Deborah Reed, and she's wonderful, and is Old Testament tutor at Spurgeon's College in South London, and it's got some excellent things to say on the book of Esther. But Fiona, thank you so much for joining me this morning and for talking through these passages. It's been really good. I've made loads of notes all the way through myself. I found this really helpful. So thank you so much.
Likewise, I found it very helpful as well. So thank you, David.
Brilliant. And if you're joining us, either listening or watching, and you want to join in the conversation, you can engage us on Twitter, and you can join the conversation by using the hashtag politics in the pulpit. We'd love to hear some of your stories, how you've used these texts, and whether there's anything in particular we've come across this morning that's helped you as well. But as we go into the rest of our day, we end with a blessing. So may the blessing of the God of peace and justice be with us. May the blessing of the Son who weeps the tears of the world's suffering be with us. May the blessing of the Spirit who inspires us to reconciliation and hope be with us from now and into eternity. Amen.
Amen.